All right, so welcome to a Meet the Candidate discussion. My name is Jessica McDonald, and I am the president of the League of Women Voters of Corvallis. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan education and advocacy organization, and we believe in a democracy where every single individual has the right, the knowledge, and the desire to participate. Today, I am here with Dan Rayfield, Democratic candidate for Oregon's 16th State House District. Welcome, Dan.
Thanks for having us.
First off, we're just going to launch right in. Dan, if you could tell us a little bit about your background and why you were running for the Oregon House.
Yeah, so two-part question, and some of those watching this may know me. So for the folks that don't, again, my name is Dan Rayfield. I'm the current state representative for House District 16, which encompasses Corvallis, Philomath, and obviously Oregon State University in that mix. I've been in the seat since roughly the 2014 election. In the legislative side of things, I'm kind of in the budgetary world. I serve as the co-chair of the Joint Ways and Means Committee, which really focuses on developing state budgets and things like that. When I'm outside of the legislature, my job is an attorney. We have our main offices in Albany. We have a satellite office in Corvallis and one in Portland as well. The legislature is a part-time job, so that's what really pays the bills. And for those who care, I still have student loan debt still working off. On the other side of things, in a personal life, my family consists of my wife and our son Adam, who's 9 years old, and he is a student at Husky Elementary. And right now, he's downstairs doing online education using a Corvallis School District iPad, which is very neat, which is hopeful because that means that maybe he won't come in and interrupt the Zoom, which is always fun. That seems to be a recurring theme in our house. So with that said, why did I decide to run it? And really, it's an interesting year. This is a very dynamic year in so many ways, as everyone knows. And when you made the decision to run, it was a lot of the events that have transpired over 2020 had not come to fruition at that point. And so, when you first run for the legislature, one of the big passions for me was K through 12 investment, right? Making game-changing revenue increases. There was focuses on finding a stable revenue stream for Oregon's health plan, paid family medical leave. And during this last session, frankly, we made one of the biggest investments in K through 12 education ever, $2 billion. We did find a stable funding stream for Medicaid, while I do believe there's still room for improvement there. And you're looking at paid family leave. And so you ask yourself when you're doing this is, can I make a difference? Do I have a vision? And is there a way to start moving? Do you still have that excitement inside of you to run for this office? And for me, the big reason that I always ran in the first place was wealth inequality. I think this is a persistent problem across not just Oregon, but in the United States. And that's something that is frankly, a big motivating factor for me in a lot of the decisions that I make. I think we finally start seeing momentum on racial injustice. We have yet to make meaningful change on climate change. We still have persistent problems in higher education funding and student loan debt. While we've made progress in K through 12, you can't be satisfied. There's always room for improvement, and a lot of people might find that very difficult, even though we just invested $2 billion. How do you improve on that? There's still, frankly, how do you utilize the money? Thinking about early childhood education is absolutely critical as new science has come out over the last decade. How can we start absorbing that? Behavioral health, persistent problem. And myself, I'm a single payer advocate, and I don't think we can be satisfied for those of us who are in that space until every Oregon has a means to affordable health care. So that's where it started out, right, is wanting to run. And then you have the pandemic hit, right? And the state's economy shifted dramatically. You have wildfires and swaths of communities that are going to be impacted for a really long time. And so you start thinking about, well, those real reasons you first decide to run don't change, right? But now you have this new focus where in the position that I sit, having the right leadership at the table when you're facing significant budget shortfalls, having the right leadership and choosing to where to prioritize dollars, having the right and having a plan, a vision, how are you going to get there is extremely critical. It presents one of the largest challenges that this state will face. And so those are some of the things right now that are really motivating motivating me as we get back. How are we going to set up investment packages so that Oregon can actually recover out of this recession and mitigate the impacts of this recession? How do we take care of the Oregonians impacted by wildfires? And so, while, like I said, while those initial things are still there while you're running, you really start to shift, and it's changed over this time. And this is the first time in 4 elections that has happened where there's been this massive shift in the focus of internally what's inside of you to run, why it shifts. And so that's kind of where I am personally at today.
Thank you, Dan. That really leads into a follow-up question on that, which is, you were talking about the priorities and the impacts this year, especially as we look at the pandemic and, gosh, even in the last week with wildfires and the devastating impacts we're seeing here in Oregon. So as you look to the coming year, what are some of the financial priorities, the budgetary priorities for the 2021 session that you're seeing?
Well, and I think the rough part of the pandemic is normally we have like the League of Women Voters forums, and we're able to kind of talk about the present state of things. So I kind of want to start there. We're expecting, given the revenue decline, some of the caseload growth and other things like that, that will be roughly short about $3 to $4 billion in the next biennia. And obviously things fluctuate. We have a revenue forecast coming out next week. So by the time most folks watch this, we'll have a different opinion on what that looks like. But generally in your head, start thinking about $3 to $4 billion. To give you context, that when we were looking in 2017, when we had a shortfall that was roughly about I think it started out at around 1.6 billion, and we were looking at significant cuts into various areas as we were trying to find a stable revenue stream for the Affordable Care Act. And so we walk into this session with that. Oregon is well suited, frankly. The leadership over the past decade has been, very thoughtful in the way that we've set reserves aside. We walked into this pandemic with roughly $1.7 billion in reserves, and we were able to use some of those reserves to shore up this last budget where we weren't having to make draconian cuts. As we go into this next session, we'll have about $1.2 billion set aside for reserves. We will have some of the reductions, minimal impacts, right? Keeping vacancies open, delaying programs. We'll have those savings coming in. We will have hopefully a tobacco tax, which is on the ballot in the fall, which I'm supporting. There are a whole bunch of host of other things that kind of come together. Once we look at, there are low-hanging fruit on revenue. Again, getting back to me, what does a good revenue stream look like? I believe in a progressive tax structure. I think we can do in Oregon to make our tax structure more progressive. We potentially will have just now had an expansion of our Medicaid match rate. And what that means is we're taking in more federal dollars, which really allows us to free up some of our general fund dollars to preserve some of those core services. When you do all of those things, you really start to see how we can be able to shore up a $3 billion budget shortfall with what I would say kind of honing in on what are the most priority services, keeping K through 12 whole, maintaining the Oregon Health Plan. In the past, decades ago, people looked at, okay, do we get rid of dental, or there are cuts to benefits? I don't believe we should be doing any of those things. Looking at the Department of Human Services, that is a budget that touches some of the most vulnerable Oregons, thinking about temporary assistance for needy families, prioritizing housing. Housing was a crisis before we got into the pandemic. It is not getting any better. And so those are, and I would also look at higher education funding. And what I think a really important thing for our audiences and our communities to understand is just because we may get out of the next budgetary session where it looks like on paper that we're maintaining a lot of the service level, the reality is that in the communities, that impact is going to be felt in different ways. So think about universities and community colleges, one example. They have other revenue streams than just the state. Those are going to be impacted, and they're going to have to deal with those realities in their own way. K through 12 is another one. We could fund at the same level, right, as the last biennium, but the reality is to serve students remotely costs more money. There's technology, there's other things like that we have to invest in these systems to mitigate the impacts of the recession. So while we shore this up, we also need to strategically create an investment package for Oregon, which helps us mitigate the impacts of the recession, one that takes care of Oregonians impacted by wildfires. So it's not just a simple mathematical exercise of prioritizing and making reductions. It's going to be a combination of reserves, reductions, strategically on non-essential type services, preserving those services, and then having an investment component as well. That's really how I see ourselves tackling the next budgetary cycle. So, and I think I mentioned this before we started, it's like I really approach this with a sense of optimism, right? A sense of opportunity. Then what is your vision? And then you got to have a plan to get there. And so that's, again, that also kind of ties into why are you doing it? Why are you running, right? Because I really believe we can make a difference in the next biennium in a meaningful way. Boy, we're going to cut through that 15 minutes quick.
Right. So you were just talking about opportunities and revisions. I'm thinking about pivoting a little bit and talking about the cap and trade bill. And the last two sessions have been extremely divisive. As we look to the future, do you think that the cap and trade should be abandoned? If so, what are some of the alternatives to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and really address the larger picture of climate change?
Absolutely. And so I think the first part is putting the divisiveness in context. In the legislature, most of the bills that passed, like an overwhelming majority, I think it's like over 93, 94%, actually have multiple supporters on both sides of the aisle. And there's like a really high, like it's like 70+% that are all actually unanimous. There's these few issues, right, that are just flashpoints, frankly, in the legislature. Climate change is one of them. Certain, communities really believe that cap and trade was a threat to their existence, right? On the other side, you have other folks where I sit in this camp where I believe climate change is a threat to our existence. And the tough thing is you had majorities, when I would say super majorities in both the House and the Senate, that were elected on platforms of moving climate change legislation forward. We believe this is a pressing issue. And we went forward, and the divisiveness really showed up when the folks that didn't believe in that, which was the minority party in Oregon, chose to walk out of the legislature. And I think a lot of folks probably remember that. And that was a new tactic that was never truly used before because it couldn't be. When we went to annual sessions, we put in constitutional deadlines, which never existed before. And some of you may remember that sessions would go on until September at times. So people really could never just leave and manipulate the process. And so, for instance, if we had these same majorities and these same values, 10 years ago, 20 years or 15 years ago, climate change legislation would have passed, and you wouldn't have had that divisive national headline feel that we had. I believe we still you can't take options off the table because I believe that climate change is real. I believe we absolutely must do things, and I believe that time is ticking. And I have personal worries that, as every year goes by, I think this presidential election is critical. I think we've made significant steps backwards. We need national leadership. We need leadership in Oregon to start tackling this. So I don't think you can dismiss a policy just because, there's a minority of folks opposing that legislation, and stopping it. I think we need to think, how are we going to tackle this in a meaningful way? If this is the way we can do it, we need to stop playing procedural games, and we need to pass the policies that voters elected us to pass. I think there are other solutions. You can look at, there's taxes on carbon, there's a whole bunch of other things, but when it comes down to it, in Oregon, the minority party does not want these policies to pass. Any climate change legislation is going to be as divisive as the other. Most folks who oppose these absolutely will not constructively put forth alternatives to climate change, which is rough. And I get why they don't want to go that direction, because they believe it's a threat to their community. And so I totally understand where they're coming from on that. I just happen to disagree on the approach to climate change. There are other things that I think we should be doing, in terms of cap and trade. Or in climate change legislation, utilities are a big driver of our carbon output. We need to start transitioning to renewable sources. One of those ways in Oregon is building up a robust solar program, and looking into that, which is something that I'm very excited about. The other thing I'm very excited about is we have product labels on our food, right? There are ways, and other states have put product labels on the carbon output of various products, think steel and concrete. what we're able to do in that way is use the existing information that we have on those products, because they're developed differently, and then also take into account transportation costs and how does that impact into the carbon footprint of these products. As a state, when we're doing the Department of Transportation or we're doing procurement, we can then incentivize or actually start taking into account what we call the external costs of the climate impact of these given products, so we can make smarter decisions as a state and live by the values that we talk about. And so that's something I'm actually very excited. The really cool thing about that is when you start factoring in transportation costs, it also starts to incentivize local businesses as well. So I don't believe that this is the narrative, this is climate versus jobs. I believe both of those can coexist together as we tackle, frankly, I think one of our biggest threats.
Well, as you talk about coexisting together, what are your thoughts about building more of a cooperative spirit in the Oregon legislature? How might we achieve that? What are your thoughts on moving more work stronger together forward?
Absolutely. So there's two things that really hit for me is trust. I think there needs, in a small legislature, having trust in each other that my opponent in this race vastly disagrees with me on a lot of these policies, but what I have to take internally that he's doing this for the right reasons, right? He's running for the right reasons internally for him. They may not match the district, and we need, and I'm doing it for the right reasons. So when we have that trust amongst each other in the legislature, we can see that it's not about personal things. It's not about, these different motivations. It's about, these are real human beings that have their own values and visions and why they're moving in a direction. And respecting that and listening is something that, frankly, every legislature, and including myself, every legislator as well, can work on. And I believe in Oregon with a smaller legislature, it's easier to do that. And frankly, we have really good relationships. The thing that to me is a bigger issue systemically in our society really comes back to how politicians interact in their communities with, whether it's not espousing, true facts, whether it's manipulating facts, being disingenuous, and really feeding, kind of the fervor and negativity in a community. There is new research that comes out that part of the divisiveness in our communities is directly related to how we act as elected officials. And I think elected officials need to really understand that. But the problem is when we act that way, right? And you feed the red meat and create the fervor in a disingenuous way, that there's positive feedback, because we as voters on the other side of the table start feeding into that as well, which gives positive feedback to our elected officials to continue that. And I think we're really seeing that at a national level. And I don't know how you fix that, frankly. I think it comes back to who we elect, within, folks that have the integrity, that understand the problem, education on the issue. But the tough part is when those tactics work, right? It just, it perpetuates the problem. But I think we have to understand that we are a part of that problem. So.
Before we wrap up, I want to ask a question that is close to the heart of League of Women Voters, which is redistricting. With the 2020 census, the redistricting will be an urgent issue. What are your thoughts on changing to an independent commission for redistricting?
So in a general sense, where right now where trust in our electoral system is paramount, and there are constant attacks to that, having a redistricting process that takes away the partisan attacks of how districts are made, I think is very important, frankly. And every party is going to be in the majority in Oregon at some point, and every party is going to be responsible for redistricting under the current system, and everybody's going to bicker with that. So I'm very open to the idea of a redistricting commission. I think, as you probably know, there was a a potential ballot measure that didn't make it on. I think that that was a good start. I think, there was some criticism that I didn't agree with. There were some criticisms that I did agree with, where I think we can bring in different communities, specifically BIPOC communities, more into the conversation to create a more well-rounded commission moving forward. So I love the idea. I like where things are headed. I do believe there's a little bit of room for improvement, which is, frankly, looking at California's system, which is as loosely based off of, I think there's room for improvement in their system too. So I think those are things I'm excited about, as we move forward. And then frankly, how do we pivot to this next session where we are going to be talking about redistricting, and how do we do that in a way that doesn't alienate people and has trust from, the entire state, which is tough in this environment.
Great. So finally, Dan, just tell us and the voters, why should we choose you over your opponent?
Absolutely. When it comes down to it, elections are about values. Who do you think in a cycle has, most fits your values, right? And who can take those values and actually do something about it? And I think in this case, in our community, there's a clear choice between the two candidates. If you are someone, that values the Affordable Care Act, wants to ensure that all Oregonians continue to have health care, move towards single payer, I'm probably your candidate in that situation. If you're someone who believes in climate change, if you're someone who believes that we need to do something in the legislature, no matter how difficult it is, I'm probably your candidate under those circumstances. Campaign finance reform, that's something that I've been a champion on statewide. If that's your issue, there's probably no other person in the state legislature right now moving on that, because it's why it got me into elections with campaign finance reform. But that's those who know me would say, Dan, shut up, don't hijack this part of the conversation to talk about campaign finance reform. I'm probably the candidate for you on that. When it comes to education, and knowing, in terms of where are we going to go in early childhood education, investments, I think there would have been a different outcome if my opponent had been in the legislature when you had the $2 billion package that we had to vote on, given some of the things that have been said. So those are some really stark differences between the two of us. And at the end of, the day, when you look at those, I believe my values, my vision, and collectively our values, our vision as a community align, more than my opponents.
Thank you, Representative Rayfield, for your time and your responses. For all you voters out there, this interview is being posted on the League of Women Voters of Corvallis website, as well as on vote411.org. Thank you so much for joining us, Dan.
Thank you so much.